Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is our first online lesson that is within our civics and economics course. With this being done, you can take your notes just like you would regularly in a notebook. You can type them up in a Google Doc, and then when we are done with this unit, we'll have a short open note quiz that will be a Google form that will be posted on Classroom and or Schoology. Okay, so today we're talking about promoting growth and stability. The biggest thing to talk about is within economics that we have macro and micro. Macro meaning the large, micro meaning the smaller. With that in mind, macroeconomics studies our entire economy as a whole, where microeconomics might just be households, firms, or one system like the farming industry or oil industry, things like that. Our government is most focused on the macroeconomic trends to make sure that our GDP, our gross domestic product, is enhanced and is working. When we do that, we look at the business cycle. Maybe you can remember that I had that graph in my classroom, but if not, there's a great one right here where the business cycle goes up and down and up and down. It does not really fall under the law of physics. What goes down must go up, but what goes up must go down, and vice versa. So the business cycle is measured in growths, peaks, recessions, and troughs or depressions, and it's to make sure that everything is going well. Like a roller coaster, it can go up and down and can be measured depending on how good things are. But this is to track and see just how good our country is doing as a whole. It makes sure that we can have a good employment rate, keep prices stable, and think about our work ethic and new technologies. Our GDP, we've talked about this before. This is the total value of all final goods and services produced in a country. So if you are a server at a restaurant, you're counted in the GDP. If you produce a car, that's counted in the GDP. If you buy a car, also counted in the GDP. And if you're the car salesman, it's also counted. So these are all the products that are taken in. The business cycles are like waves. You can ride high and be awesome, but then sometimes you're going to see a big old wipeout with a recession, which is something that we may be dealing with in the near future. Within growth, you will see that the GDP goes up. So, just like a graph, just like a roller coaster, if it's going up, that means that GDP goes up. If it starts to go down, the GDP goes down. And the business cycle can change because of so many factors, whether it be stocks, whether it be people who are trying to, cut short and cheat the system. If there is a downturn in a market, one of the biggest things that we'll talk about would be like the Great Recession from 2008 because of the collapse of the housing market. Three biggest things to remember would be high employment, economic growth, stability, and security for looking at how our GDP can be measured and to make sure that our government is functioning best for our people. Okay. With employment, we try to make sure there are enough jobs for everyone who is able and willing to work. Unemployment rates normally between 4% and 6% are considered healthy. But what you need to consider is that not all people are counted in the employment rate or unemployment rate. I always think about like cyclical unemployment, the people who play Santa Claus at the mall. They're not necessarily considered unemployed. People who are landscapers during the winter who cannot work are not really considered unemployed. Same thing with the elderly if they're not looking for a job too. Economic growth makes sure that we can cut taxes. If you cut taxes, that is where people have more money in their pockets and they personally can increase spending, but that means that the government doesn't necessarily have as much money, which could be a bad thing. It's one of those double-sided coins. The best thing that we can have for security and stability are the general level of prices. If prices are healthy, and when I say healthy, meaning the consumers can purchase them, can buy them, and they are able to be happy with that, that is healthy. So if there's a surplus of cars because people can't afford cars, that would be a bad thing and not be the most stable market for that. So you'd have to lower it. So many things that we have Might be that they don't want that car. It's not as eco-friendly, things of that like. But so if you see a drastic shift in prices and the price drops, then people definitely might go for it. Some things that we need to regulate and maintain are banks in the stock market so people can feel safe and can regulate these by the government. Our biggest technological processes, and here's our good man Thomas Edison over here, has to do with making sure that people are protected with their own ideas. Once something becomes obsolete, you don't need it, that market drops off, too bad, so sad. You would consider any sort of obsolete thing, maybe like beepers, fax machines, things within the last 20 years that have completely almost dropped off. But when you have those patents and copyrights, a patent is something to an inventor, like a new light bulb, a new computer, but then a copyright would be something like a creative work, like a comic book hero or something like that. Okay. Our government's role is also to make sure that they are a provider. They are somebody who is researching, developing, creating their own institutions that people in the private sector might not have access to. Do people in the private sector have access to things like space travel? Sure, people have gone to space on their own, but the government can put as much or as little funding into something like that. And they can also grant people those patents and copyrights within their own entity. All right. And to wrap up today, we're going to talk about our American work ethic and the idea of how hard should you work to make sure that you are able to contribute to the economy. Our individual effort, our pride, our work ethic, not everybody wants to work as hard as they possibly can, but it is certainly something that we can promote. Okay. With that in mind, your work ethic is your commitment to work. And that wraps up us for today. Next time, we're going to talk about providing public goods. Thank you very much for listening. And be sure to check Schoology and Google Classroom for an assignment.